Where did you get this ring? Mr. Burke was so shocked that he did not notice how he squeezed the hand of a young secretary by force. How did you get my great-grandmother's ring? Eva looked with horror at the pale chief. Mr. Burke squeezed her hand even more and the girl screamed harder. Mr. Burke, it hurts me. Are you out of your mind? This is my mom's jewelry. She lent it to me for tonight. What the hell, Mom? Mr. Burke got angry and suddenly stopped. What is your mother's name? Eva did not have time to answer when a call came from somewhere. The doors of the box flung open and the German partners of Mr. Burke, invited by him to the ballet, spilled out into the corridor where this ridiculous dialogue between him and Eva took place. During the break of the performance, Mr. Burke did not manage to be alone with her to ask thousands of questions. Foreigners did not leave a single step from the charming blonde, fluently chirping in German. Mr. Burke sat through the second act as if on pins and needles. He winced in disgust at the sound of applause. It seemed that the whole audience in the hall knew about Mr. Burke's nervous state and arranged applause out of spite. When will this endless dance end, which for some reason many people sincerely consider art? The day-to-day did not set itself in the morning. Mr. Burke had a big quarrel with his obstinate mistress Margarita. The beauty was offended that Mr. Burke again did not call on her and flatly refused to go to the theater in the evening, where the general director of a medical equipment company invited foreign partners. Margot, that was the last straw. Mr. Burke angrily threw the phone on the table and began to pace the spacious office. Mr. Burke noticed who was standing at the door and exhaling. He looked out into the waiting room. Habitually pretending that he didn't see a small queue of visitors, he briefly ordered the secretary, "Bring coffee, just black coffee without sugar, otherwise bring a whole tray of some kind of sweet rubbish, such as cookies." Returning to his table, Mr. Burke mentally imagined an angry and haughty face, blinked as many times as he spoke these idiotic words about the last straw. This is what scares him. Why continue to get stuck in a relationship that burdens him more and more every day? A polite knock on the door. Eva, the secretary, entered the office, holding a small square tray with a single china cup in her hands. "Mr. Burke, your coffee." "Black without sugar and with various sweet rubbish," the girl smiled. Mr. Burke's heart warmed up. This sweet girl, who has been working in the company for the second month, really liked him. A thin blonde with long hair and intelligent gray eyes vaguely resembled someone. But unfortunately she had a husband. Handsome and pleasant in communication, Heike visited his wife at work several times. They got married only 6 months ago, looked at each other with admiring glances, and Mr. Burke took pleasure in secretly watching a couple in love. It was evident that between the newlyweds there are no grievances, lies, stupid jealousy. Speaking of jealousy, Mr. Burke came up with a brilliant idea. "Eva, I saw your husband here a couple of times. He gives the impression of a completely adequate person." "What, Mr. Burke?" The girl frowned in annoyance. "I mean that he will not go crazy with jealousy if I invite you to the theater in the evening. Margot cannot go." Quickly assessing the situation, the secretary smiled. "It's possible, and how to say it," the chef grinned, "but I wouldn't want to go to performances without a partner, especially since you know the language and you don't have to drag this boring translator with you. Help out, Eva. Tell me that you are going under my personal responsibility. They will bring you and take you away." "This is not necessary. Heike will bring me, and then meet me after the performance." In the theater, Eva charmed foreigners with her excellent manners, brilliant knowledge of the language, and a beaming smile. Mr. Burke, who saw the girl every day and always considered her pretty, was now struck by her beauty, a slender figure in an evening blue dress, graceful hands, a proud neck, an attractive look. Mr. Burke did not like ballet, so during the first act he entertained himself by looking at the audience. He glanced at Eva, fixing her hair. On a thin finger a ring sparkled like a stone, an expensive piece of jewelry, an old one that Mr. Burke could not believe his eyes, that he did not realize how strange his behavior looked. He grabbed the girl by the wrist and, on the move, apologizing to the foreigners, literally pulled her out of the box. Mr. Burke unceremoniously pulled the ring from the frightened secretary's finger. Inside the ring, he read a painfully familiar inscription, "To love forever," and then he excitedly and demandingly asked Eva how her family jewel of his family got to her. After the performance, Mr. Burke said goodbye to partners for a long time, who were in no hurry to get into a solid car provided by the company. Smiling from right to left, Mr. Burke imperceptibly glanced at Eva, who was standing aside. She was talking to someone on the phone when the girl waved friendly to the Germans and slowly moved in the other direction. Mr. Burke almost howled with annoyance. He almost forced the guests into the car, ordered his driver and guard to wait on the run, and rushed after the secretary. But Eva did not even think of running away anywhere. She calmly waited for Mr. Burke to approach. "How is your mother's name?" the boss panted out. Mrs. Poole. Eva did not take her attentive eyes off him, as if she knew in advance about the subsequent reaction. Despite the fact that Mr. Burke had been waiting for this exact answer for an hour, he suddenly turned out to be unprepared for it. He was confused, fussed, and asked clearly, "Are you Poole?" "But I'm Poole's husband," Eva gently clarified. She didn't study, of course. Mr. Burke, his girlfriend, interrupted him. "You studied together at the university. Do you know who I am?" Mr. Burke asked stupidly. "I mean, you know she's connected to my mom. I knew that at the university my mother met with a certain Mr. Burke, that she loved him very much, but when I got a job in your company, I had no idea that it was you. The surname is common, especially since there are foreign languages, and here a large company, medical equipment. This is a family business," the man growled. "And 2 weeks ago I showed my mother a photo from a corporate party and she immediately recognized you." Eva smiled. Mr. Burke felt a nagging pain in his heart. 2 weeks means Mrs. Poole did not find time to contact him or did not want to. "Why did she give you that ring?" "Mom didn't give it to me, I confess. Eva herself took it." "What for?" Mr. Burke was taken aback. "Excuse me, Mr. Burke, my husband is waiting for me in the parking lot," the girl suddenly hurried, "until Monday." Mr. Burke silently looked at the trail of the fleeing Xusha, then caught himself. "How old are you?" Eva in pursuit. 22. Eva turned around for a second and waved goodbye as she opened the front door. Mr. Burke immediately heard the music. A soft light burned in the huge living room. A certain woman with a glass of wine sat on the sofa, stretching her infinitely long legs. "Mr. Burke, I decided to forgive you," she declared with an air of importance. Mr. Burke carefully examined the young seductress as if he saw her for the first time. "Who is this alien woman? What is she doing in his apartment?" He didn't move. He searched in vain for answers to questions he should have asked himself a long time ago. Margarita sensed something was wrong and immediately changed her tone. "Darling, is it all right that you are silent? Why am I the only one who always has to work on our relationship? What are you talking about?" Mr. Burke was surprised. "The scheme of our relations is extremely simple. From you beauty, from me money. I'm sorry, but could you please leave, Margarita?" Opening her mouth, she saw something so adamant on her lover's face that she suddenly got up, took her purse, and went to the exit. "Leave the keys on the table, please." Mr. Burke was absolutely sure of his decision. Shocked, Margot again did not utter a word. She took out the key from her purse and put them on a glass table and, having collected the rest of her pride, with a spectacular defiant step, she left Mr. Burke's life forever. Taking off his jacket with pleasure, Mr. Burke suddenly remembered something and put his hand in his pocket. He did not return the ring to Eva. Decoration, what an idiot! What will the girl think of him? That he is an arrogant redneck who returned the family jewel, and what will Mrs. Poole think of him now? At night, Mr. Burke did not close his eyes. He drank cognac, reread the inscription inside the ring 1,000 times, and recalled his student years, the birch tree, his first and only love. So that's why, at the sight of Eva, his heart sank. From quiet joy, as if he had met a loved one whom he had not seen for a long time. The petite blonde Evados not at all look like the tall, brown-eyed Daria, but there is certainly an elusive resemblance between mother and daughter. A light rustling laugh, a manner of straightening her hair, an elegant turn of the head, a friendly look, funny dimples on her cheeks. Memories fell upon Mr. Burke with such force, as if these 17 years of separation had never happened. To love forever. How he loved the birch tree. His breath caught at the mere thought of her, how he loved the golden sparks in his brown eyes, slightly green dark eyebrows, plump lips, always ready to smile. When the sun hit her brown hair, it took on some amazing chocolate hue. At that moment, Mr. Burke literally froze with delight. A capital young man from a wealthy family, he was so proud of his golden girl, who came to the capital from a remote province and entered a prestigious university the first time. It was love at first sight. They could not part even for a minute. Every evening Mr. Burke waited even in the hostel, and they walked until late at night in the nearest public garden, as if enchanted, wandered along the circular paved path, nodding to the already familiar residents of neighboring houses with different dogs on a leash. Lantern light, fallen leaves sparkling with all shades of yellow. From golden to pale lemon. Mrs. Poole liked the blood-red maple leaves the most. The whole room in the hostel was lined with autumn bouquets. Sometimes Mrs. Poole's friends mercifully gave the couple in love the opportunity to be together and went to spend the night in another place. Behind the wall, the neighbor's TV was screaming, student life was buzzing in the corridor, but they were busy with each other. The couple did not hear a sound. The moon dimly illuminated the government dwelling, breaking through the frosty patterns on the glass. In the spring, a lush branch of a lilac bush persistently knocked on the window on the first floor, and in the summer the intoxicating smell of jasmine filled the room. All Birch, we have been meeting for more than a year, as long as possible. I want to kiss you every second for days. Hold your hand. The guy pressed Mrs. Poole's hand to her cheek, then touched her finger with his lips. I already call everyone around Mrs. Poole, and the housekeeper, and my mother's stylist, and the janitor, and today I look at the gloomy face of my mother's driver and say, Mrs. Poole. Mother told me to come at 6. What are you lying? Mrs. Poole, I swear, I'm baked. It's time to get married. You are sure? The girl looked at him with a happy but incredulous look. Are you not? Maybe you don't want to marry me? Mr. Burke feigned indignation. I dream about it. I'm just very afraid of your mother, Daria admitted. To be honest, Mr. Burke himself was worried that the imperious, categorical Miss would not want to see a simple provincial as her daughter-in-law. He was already mentally prepared for the upcoming fight. His mother reacted very favorably to his request to meet Mrs. Poole. Miss even cooked a light dinner with her own hands, which she had not done for many years. The evening passed in a warm, almost family atmosphere. Mr. Burke saw that the well-bred, sincere Mrs. Poole liked his mother. Mr. Burke was happy that his guess was confirmed when my mother began to invite the girl with her to a beauty salon, to shopping stores, to the theater. When the couple announced their decision to get married, Miss carefully looked at the lovers and left the room. She returned a couple of minutes later with a small velvet box. A family ring fell into Mrs. Poole's hands. Dashenka, this ring was given to my grandmother by her fiancé, my grandfather, during the engagement. See what's written inside. To love forever. You, two, always love each other and don't even say nasty words out loud, like divorce. Mrs. Poole was touched to the core. We agreed to get married in 6 months, immediately after the end of the second year. For the new year, they planned to go to Mrs. Poole's hometown. Mr. Burke was impatient to meet his future mother-in-law. In early December, on a Saturday evening, Mrs. Poole's mother asked her not to come to her tomorrow. I feel so bad. I think the flu is starting. You don't come, otherwise you will get sick too. But how could Mr. Burke be stopped by the imaginary danger of some kind of infection if he managed to get madly bored in a day? The guy walked carelessly whistling. He carried his beloved berries and a box with an orchid. He happily looked forward to how his surprise would please Mrs. Poole. Mr. Burke, are you crazy? Raspberries, blueberries. She pounced on him. Girlfriend, this is insanely expensive. What a charm. This is your orchid. Mr. Burke found Mrs. Poole alone in the room. The girl hastily packed her things, seeing her lover, blushed and looked at him with such frightened eyes, as if the guy had caught her at the scene of the crime. But where are we going? I hope not to my mother. Mr. Burke jokingly snatched a blue sweater from Mrs. Poole's hands. Birch, just don't say that I guessed right. We were going to go before the New Year holidays, 3 weeks left. Give it back. Daria irritably took away his sweater and continued to pack things without turning to Mr. Burke. Quietly but somehow ruthlessly said, I'm leaving forever, sorry. You are crazy? Mr. Burke casually waved his hand, still not realizing what was happening, but after a second he realized that Mrs. Poole was not joking. Daria, what happened? Did something happen at your house? Is your mom sick? Nothing happened. Mrs. Poole indifferently looked into his eyes. I just fell out of love with you and I don't want any wedding. Per day? Mr. Burke refused to believe in this nightmare happening before his eyes. She suddenly hated me so much that she even decided to quit university right before the session? Imagining, Mr. Burke now, with pain in his soul, recalled this strange morning. He said something, convinced, begged, insulted from impotence and resentment, took away a bag with things. But Mrs. Poole was adamant. When Mr. Burke, in desperation, brushing away evil tears from his face, finally threw things right under his feet, the girl calmly picked up her bag and silently left forever. Dark days have come for Mr. Burke. The guy, indifferent to alcohol, suddenly got drunk, so much so that he didn't even notice how he flunked the session. Worried, Mess offered her son to find the girl, but offended to the core, he flatly refused maternal help. This is stupid, son. Maybe something really happened to Mrs. Poole, and you are inactive, reveling in your own pride. You can't do that, Mom. Mr. Burke looked coldly. I won't drink more often. I promise I'll stop suffering from this moment, but please don't interfere with my life. Never talk to me about her. So many years have passed, and Mr. Burke has not been able to explain to himself Mrs. Poole's strange act of dropping out of school and breaking into no one knows where, no one knows why, and then it dawned on Mr. Burke. He broke up with Mrs. Poole 17 years ago, and Ivy's 22 years old. It turns out when they met we already had a 5-year-old daughter. Why didn't she say a word, and the girl was a daughter? What does this have to do with the stuffy, hasty flight? Mr. Burke felt that he was going crazy. He had to talk with Eva tomorrow and find out everything once and for all. However, in the morning Mr. Burke simply nodded unevenly to his secretary and quickly went to his office. The girl stopped him at the door. Wait, Mr. Burke. Eva got up from the table. Forgive me for this ring trick, please. Mom scolded me so much and Hike also scolded me. Sorry. Really, why did you do it? Mr. Burke asked with sincere curiosity. That idiot just sighed. Eva has seen how her mother can't find a place for herself since she saw you in the photo. Photo decided to arrange, as it were, a chance meeting. Okay, I forgive you. All this is nonsense, Eva. Slightly disappointed, Mr. Burke opened the office door and then the secretary handed him a piece of paper. This is my mother's number. She asked you to call if you wish. They met in the park where they loved to walk so many years ago. Just as brightly red and golden leaves rustled underfoot. Also, dog walkers with their 4-legged pets walked along the paths. A fine, insinuating rain fell. At the sight of a slender woman under a lilac umbrella, Mr. Burke's throat tightened with excitement. 40-year-old Mrs. Poole was beautiful as in her youth. Mr. Burke tremblingly took Mrs. Poole by the hand. Mutual embarrassment and awkwardness made me talk about extraneous topics, joke a lot, remember former classmates, and talk about my current life. It turns out that after 3 years Daria recovered at the university, only transferred to the correspondence department. For a while she worked as a teacher in her hometown. Then a friend offered me a position as a French teacher. Now Daria worked there as a head teacher. She is a happy mother of 2 adult children, a daughter and a son. That's why my secretary has such a brilliant ability for languages, Mr. Burke said. German, French, Italian. Mrs. Poole, can I ask about Eva? Mrs. Poole said that at the age of 18 she gave birth to a daughter from a neighbor guy with whom she had been friends since kindergarten. He was a wonderful person. A couple of months before the birth of Eva, he drowned when Daria went to the Capitol. The grandmother took care of the baby. Mrs. Poole's mother always dreamed that her only blood would learn and get on her feet. The girl was not going to hide her daughter from Mr. Burke, but at first she wanted to make sure that they had a serious relationship, and then she waited a long time for the right moment to tell everything. They walked around the square for more than an hour before Mr. Burke decided to ask the only question that worried him. "Why did you leave me?" "Mr. Burke, so many years have passed, does it matter now?" There were golden sparks in her eyes. "How is Mom doing?" "She died 3 years ago." Mr. Burke said softly and suddenly stopped abruptly in the middle of a narrow path. "Dasha, did my mother force you to leave?" "Don't scream, please. Is it worth talking about it now?" Mrs. Poole asked thoughtfully. "Costs." He had no doubts, and Daria told how one day Nicholas, Mrs. Burke's driver, met her near the university and said that the hostess was waiting in the car. Mr. Burke's mother no longer played an intelligent, sweet lady. She offered Mrs. Poole money and firmly stated that she would never allow her son to marry a rootless provincial. "Daria will bitterly regret if she does not leave Mrs. Burke behind." I didn't believe my ears then, but you remember how warmly she received me. When she asked why she changed her mind about me so drastically, she answered that she was always against our relationship. She just pretended not to look soulless in the eyes of her adored son. Mrs. Poole said that at the age of 18 she gave birth to a daughter from a neighbor guy with whom she had been friends since kindergarten. He was a wonderful person. A couple of months before the birth of Eva, he drowned when Daria went to the Capitol. The grandmother took care of the baby. Mrs. Poole's mother always dreamed that her only blood would learn and get on her feet. The girl was not going to hide her daughter from Mr. Burke, but at first she wanted to make sure that they had a serious relationship, and then she waited a long time for the right moment to tell everything. They walked around the square for more than an hour before Mr. Burke decided to ask the only question that worried him. "Mrs. Poole, why did you leave me?" "Volodya, so many years have passed, does it matter now?" There were golden sparks in her eyes. "How is Mom doing?" "She died 3 years ago." Mr. Burke said softly and suddenly stopped abruptly in the middle of a narrow path. "Mrs. Poole, did my mother force you to leave?" "Don't scream, please. Is it worth talking about it now?" Mrs. Poole asked thoughtfully. "Costs." He had no doubts, and Daria told how one day Nikolai, Mrs. Burke's driver, met her near the university and said that the hostess was waiting in the car. Mr. Burke's mother no longer played an intelligent, sweet lady. She offered Mrs. Poole money and firmly stated that she would never allow her son to marry a rootless provincial. "Daria will bitterly regret if she does not leave Mr. Burke behind." I didn't believe my ears then, but you remember how warmly she received me. When she asked why she changed her mind about me so drastically, she answered that she was always against our relationship. She just pretended not to look soulless in the eyes of her adored son. But now she is forced to intervene, because the daughter of her best friends returns from London in the spring. Mrs. Burke has long dreamed of you getting married, so she won't let some upstart ruin her son's whole life. Of course, I threw the envelope to my mother on the seat, declared that I was not going to refuse you. Mr. Burke was afraid of what he might hear. It was quiet for 2 weeks, then this Nicholas stopped me near the hostel, handed me a photograph. Eva was on it. I immediately realized that my daughter was recently secretly photographed, which means that this driver went to my hometown. I was terribly frightened. You remember the face of this Nicholas? An immovable grimace. Did he threaten you as a child? Mr. Burke asked in a hoarse voice. He is not a single. He didn't say a word, he just took Eva's photograph from me and tore it in half. Everything was very clear to me. I almost went crazy with fear. I could only think about daughters. Forgive me, I also hated the whole world in those moments. Mr. Burke, shocked, was silent. Then they stood for a long time at Mrs. Poole's car. If you were not married, I would invite you to dinner at a restaurant, Mr. Burke shyly admitted. Let's go. I'm not married, Mrs. Poole just said, and never was. But you have a son like, Mr. Burke was confused. Daria took out her phone from her bag and showed Tikin a photo. A handsome gray-eyed guy looked at the camera lens with a serious look. His name is Blover. He is 16 and a half. So yes, this is your son. When I ran away from your family, I did not know that I was expecting a child. I'm sorry I didn't inform you. But you haven't been looking for me all these years either. Mrs. Poole wiped a tear from her eyelashes. At first we are young and stupid, we protect and cherish only ourselves, and when we understand what is needed as a priceless treasure to protect a loved one, it becomes too late. Forgive me, don't say anything, don't get angry, don't blame and try to understand. Just forgive. Mr. Burke was silent, staring with fat eyes at his beloved woman, then he barely audibly spoke. Does he know about me? Yes, I often talked about you, and the other day I showed him that photo from the corporate party. He liked the way you look. Mrs. Poole smiled affectionately. Maybe to hell with this dinner at the restaurant, let's go to my house. My son was already waiting. The lump in my throat made it difficult to breathe. Then Mr. Burke suddenly remembered something. Give me, this Friday I accidentally stole your ring, but now I forgot to take it with me, and I'll give it to you tomorrow.